The determination of what an author meant, or what an author intended, still regulates our engagement with texts, especially in the case of living authors. In 2007, the same year that she published the final volume of her Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling outed her beloved character Dumbledore. In January of this year, she admitted that Harry Potter and Hermione Granger, in her mind, should have ended up together, now that she's looking back at the series as a whole, and that Hermione's marriage to Ron Weasley was probably a mistake. Though I can't say that I have my fingers on the pulse of Harry Potter fandom, I do know that a great deal of buzz was kicked up in the blogosphere, and on discussion forums, and on internet news sites because of Rowling's comments. We might add our own questions and comments to this odd eruption of discourse. First, we are dealing with two very different authorial interventions here. The first intervention states a fact about the literary world as it is, though Dumbledore's sexual orientation is not necessarily an explicitly stated fact of that world. Rowling is not seeking to change that world in outing Dumbledore, but only to give readers a different understanding of it. In the latter intervention, concerning Harry and Hermione, Rowling is expressing a regret and proposing a better version of the literary world she has created. Despite this difference, a statement about the literary world as it is versus a statement suggesting a change to that world, one problem links both of these comments. The existing series itself, this specific set of novels, is not enough. It is somehow incomplete. A private mind continues to take a sovereign position in regard to what the series is meant to do and what its individual novels might mean. What must we as readers do with authorial statements that insist on a gap between the composition of a text, its execution, the work that it does on its own in the world, and the author's continuing intentions, aims, goals, desires, and hopes for it? And what might we do when the author's position on his or her own work changes? And number two, so that was all the first set of questions or comments I had. Number two, a much more general question. To what degree is the author an authority on a text he or she or Z has written? Does the answer to this question depend on the genre? Is a journalist or an essayist more of an authority on what his or her text might mean than a novelist or a poet? Does it matter whether the text is critical or creative or some mixture of both? Even if an author retains copyright over a text, what is the author's relation to our judgment of its meanings? Is he or she a signifying sovereign? One of the first modes of literary criticism that English majors learn about, or study, when they take a class like English 201 at the University of Rhode Island, Principles of Literary Study, is formalism, or what is commonly called, now somewhat ironically, new criticism. Ironically, because it seems to have aged quite a bit over the last 7-8 decades. An ideal new critic would not be all that concerned with Rowling's comments, for he or she would be interested only in the successful meaningfulness of a text itself. Once Rowling makes her work public, she is no longer the source or the standard of her novel's meanings, or her readers' judgments of their aesthetic success. This rather hardline approach might sound attractive to Harry Potter fans traumatized by Rowling's statements, especially the latter one. It seems to me most Harry Potter fans might be quite happy about the first one. But what justification could there possibly be for such a critical position, right? This hardline stance. In 1946, William K. Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley, English professor and a philosophy professor, respectively, co-authored a seminal paper of new criticism, or what would come to be a seminal paper of new criticism, entitled The Intentional Fallacy, in which they give sense and substance to the stance of bracketing out any concern with authorial intention in the critical judgment of a literary work. The essay is broken up into 5 sections of various lengths. In the first, Wimsatt and Beardsley, hereafter referred to as WB, provide their thesis, and I'll read it a few times. Quote, "The design or intention of the author is neither available nor desirable as a standard for judging the success of a work of literature." End quote. I'll read that again. The design or intention of the author is neither available nor desirable as a standard for judging the success of a literary work. And here success is not monetary, but aesthetic, okay, poetic. One's position, so this is me, one's position in regard to intention in the judgment of literature is an important one, they claim. For, quote, "There is hardly a problem of literary criticism in which the critic's approach will not be qualified by his view of intention," end quote. In other words, whether one thinks about terms like, and this is WB's list, inspiration, authenticity, biography, literary history, and scholarship, elusiveness, one must deal with the fact that all of these terms, and many others, which are foundational to literary study and discourse, link up in one way or another with the role of the author in how we make sense of his or her work. So think how easy it is when talking with a creative writer or with a poet to slip into a language of inspiration, right? Or when you meet someone who's enthusiastic, like I am, about Virginia Woolf or William Wordsworth or writers like that, Shakespeare, who knows what, to sort of slip into this language of sort of authorial agency, right? Or a rhetoric of genius and this sort of thing. All of that is wrapped up with concerns of intention, right? And Wimsatt and Beardsley are saying here that to really think about what one is doing as a literary critic, one has to grapple with and think through one's position in regard to how much intentionality will factor into how one gives an account of meaning. Okay. As an aside, it's worth pointing out that the word intention in this essay, The Intentional Fallacy, is not a robust philosophical concept like it is, say, in phenomenology. Intention, WB write, is simply, quote, "design or plan in the author's mind, and has obvious affinities for the author's attitude toward his work, the way he felt, and what made him write," end quote. I'll simply note, I may come back around to and comment on again, the gender-specific pronouns here. Many readers of this essay do not make it past its first part, I think, largely because the co-authors front-load the essay with a series of propositions, 5 axioms or truisms. One might wonder if a lot of misunderstanding might be avoided in literary scholarship and cultural studies if scholars front-loaded their work in a similar way. I certainly don't do that, but who knows? Anyway, I'm digressing. So the first axiom simply states that the author's intention matters a great deal for the creation of a literary work, that is, for any account of its causation. Right? But this does not mean that intention should be the standard of the judgment of that work. In short, the cause of the poem should not be conflated with the standard of literary criticism. The second axiom is that even if criticism was the art of unearthing the author's intentions, as many critics contemporaneous to Wimsatt and Beardsley insisted, that even if it was the art of unearthing authorial intention, that the greatest evidence for the successful achievement of those intentions would still be the work itself. Right? Supplementary comments like Rowling's should still have no bearing on our judgment of her novel's meanings or our accounts of their complexity. The third axiom is that, quote, poetry differs from practical messages, end quote, insofar as it, that is poetry, quote, is a feat of style. I love that phrase, a feat of style, by which a complex of meaning is handled all at once, end quote. Despite my own, perhaps, challenge to Wimsatt and Beardsley, which I'll get back around to, I really love this definition of poetry. It's very thought-provoking. There's a lot to chew on there. A feat of style by which a complex of meaning is handled all at once, end quote. If poets add to their poems later on, in interviews or letters or in their diaries that are later made public, or if they later paraphrase what they think they meant in other contexts, then their insights still have no real bearing on the primary feat itself, which must succeed or fail on its own terms. The fourth axiom insists on a distinction between the personality of the author, or his or her own personal meaning, and quote, the thoughts and attitudes of the dramatic speaker, end quote, in the poem. Right? This seems rather straightforward, right? That you shouldn't confuse the author with the sort of figure speaking in poems, or with characters in novels, or with narrators, right? Though critics, and sometimes I, am often guilty of too easily conflating the words of a character in a novel with the beliefs of his or her author. The last and fifth axiom is really not clear. At least it isn't to me, and even though I do have a few things written down here to try to make sense of it, I'm still not confident I have any clue what they're talking about. So anyway, I'll read the axiom in its entirety. Quote, if there is any sense in which an author, by revision, has better achieved his original intention, it is only the very abstract tautological sense that he intended to write a better work and now has done it. Then they put in parentheses, in this sense every author's intention is the same. They continue, his former specific intention in the previous work was not his intention in the present work. So, previous work, present work, those are my additions to the axiom. This quote is followed without explanation by a passage from Thomas Hardy's The Three Strangers, 1883 work. Quote, he's the man we were in search of, that's true, and yet he's not the man we were in search of, for the man we were in search of was not the man we wanted. End quote. I don't know. I don't know what that means. But I'm going to try to make sense of it right now. I'm not sure it's really worth getting too stuck on this last axiom, but a footnote at the bottom of the page does prove rather useful, I think. Quote, W.B. Wright, a close relative of the intentional fallacy is that of talking about means and ends in poetry instead of parts and wholes, or part and whole. This way of talking about an individual poem, so that end quote, now this is me, this way of talking about an individual poem, treating its specific words as mere as mere means, to a general end, the author's intention or design, is rather alien to us now, or at least it is to me. But it helps make sense of their point, namely that this way of thinking about intention as a general desire to write good poetry has no bearing on what matters to literary critics, who are interested in thinking through the means of the poem only, breaking it up into a consideration of parts and wholes. W-H-O-L-E-S. Though literary critics are often interested in H-O-L-E-S's too. It makes very little sense, as a critic, to be worried about whether an author thinks his or her work is better than his or her former work, since this has to do with a general desire simply to write well. It's nonsensical to say, as apparently some critics WB have in mind have said, that a latter work achieves the intentions of a former work, since specific intentions, their phrase, must by necessity change over time, over the course of an author's life. Paraphrasing the Hardy quote, we might say, ventriloquizing a poet, this new poem is the poem I originally wanted to write, and yet it isn't the one I originally intended to write, for the poem I had originally intended to write is not the poem I have wanted to write now. In short, whether or not intention is the general desire to write well, or the specific design of an author in an individual poem or novel, it should have no bearing, intention should have no bearing on our judgment of the work itself, which must succeed or fail, I say again, on its own terms, much like a good pudding, which should have all irrelevant supplementary lumps left out. This analogy between poetry and pudding, of course, is Wimsatt and Beardsley's. I'm just borrowing it. The next two paragraphs, the last two paragraphs of the first section, lead into the second part of the essay and survey the positions of four of WB's contemporaries. Though it is not really worth going into the specifics of the positions of these four contemporaries, it is worth lingering with the position of the first, E. Stroll, who argues that the critic is a judge who, quote, determines the author's meaning or intention as if the poem were a will, a contract, or the Constitution, end quote. He, that is Stroll, also asserts the poem is not the critic's own, end quote, meaning that critics who deny the importance of intention take false ownership of the meaning of the poem and are sort of sliding dangerously into a sort of relativistic or subjective space of interpretation, where really anything is up for grabs. The poem could mean anything the critic wants it to mean. WB have a rather clever response, I think, one that I'll be sort of thinking through in the next few videos in this series. Yes, they agree. The poem is not the critic's. It doesn't belong to the critic. However, it doesn't belong to the author either. For the poem, quote, is detached from the author at birth and goes about the world beyond his power to intend about it or control it, end quote. So rather sort of a queer image, isn't it? Right? The using a very gender-specific pronoun and yet adopting a rhetoric of birthing, right? And pregnancy. Anyway, something to think about in later videos, maybe. They continue, quote, the poem belongs to the public, not to the critic, not to the author, but to the public. Sort of a lateral ownership, right? Collateral ownership. It is embodied, they continue, in language, the peculiar possession of the public. And it is about the human being, an object of public knowledge, end quote. Very interesting. When I recently reread WB's essay some weeks ago when I was preparing this lecture, this distinction between public and private is one I realized I had never caught before. And it is an interesting justification for the new critical position on authorial intention. Historically, we might also see it as a pedagogical justification for the movement from teaching authorial biography in the literature classroom, which was really the norm in the early 20th century, to teaching close reading or criticism in the classroom. A skill that students can learn with very few materials. Some sort of competency in language, right? In reading narratives or verse, a pencil or pen, a sheet of paper or a laptop now, a copy of the poem, and access to a good dictionary, right? There's something very public about the learning of close reading and literary criticism, of accounting for poetry. And though the critic might be particularly excellent at it, right? Wimsatt and Beardsley are going to say that the greatest test of a critic's reading is still going to be, right, the sort of the public test of whether or not other readers agree or sympathize with that reading. Okay, so in the next video, I'll finish up my overview of the essay, and then in the third video, I'll be going over what I think is still useful in WB's article, what's still thought-provoking, I think, and also a few of my challenges to the essay too, which are really not just my own, but ones that I think have have been raised before by others. So, okay.